The sound came first, a deep, mechanical growl that rolled across the French countryside like thunder. Then came the smell: burning oil, churned earth, cordite. And finally, the sight, a dark silhouette emerging through morning fog, its armor catching the first thin streaks of sunlight. A Tiger I tank. To the men of the U.S. 3rd Armored Division, that sound was death-made mechanical. They had learned to recognize it long before they ever saw it, the steady, throaty clank of overlapping steel treads, the long-barreled 88mm cannon glinting like a spear. "Jesus," one of the infantrymen muttered, peering over a ruined stone wall. "That's another one." The sergeant spat into the mud. "Another one, same as before. 1 Tiger, 3 Shermans dead. We can't stop 'em." In a nearby trench, Corporal Daniel Reeves listened quietly, his hands resting on a coil of copper wire. He was 30, a combat engineer with a face permanently smudged by grease and exhaustion. He had built bridges under fire, wired charges on frozen rivers, and patched roads while artillery screamed overhead, but nothing haunted him like those tanks. They called them Tigers, and they lived up to the name. Their armor could shrug off anything short of an airstrike. Sherman tank rounds pinged harmlessly against their sides like pebbles. Bazookas barely scratched their paint. Every time one appeared, American soldiers scattered like ants. Daniel had seen it 3 days ago near the town of Chateau Noir. His unit had set up an ambush, mines, tank traps, the works. The Tiger rolled through it like a god of war, shredding their barricades, spitting fire from its main gun. When it was over, the town was gone, and so were half his friends. Now, he sat in the ruins of a barn, staring at the wire in his lap, a simple spool salvaged from a destroyed radio truck. A useless thing, maybe, but Daniel's mind didn't believe in useless. He twisted a loop between his fingers, eyes unfocused. "Electricity always finds the path of least resistance," he muttered. "Metal finds metal." "Reeves," a voice barked. It was Lieutenant Hall, his commanding officer, mud-covered, exhausted, too young to have lines etched so deep in his face. "What the hell are you mumbling about?" Daniel looked up, trying to figure out why the Tigers don't short when they hit live lines. "We've got power cables everywhere, broken grids, street lines, but they just roll through." Hall shook his head. "They're tanks, Reeves, not radios. You're not going to hack them with a wire." Daniel gave a small smile. "We'll see." The lieutenant sighed. "Fine, just stay alive till morning. Intel says another Tiger's headed this way." That night, the rain came cold and relentless. Daniel huddled inside the barn with a small generator, an oil lamp, and a mind that refused to rest. He had grown up in a machine shop in Ohio. His father fixed power tools. His mother wired electrical motors during the Depression. He had spent his childhood tinkering with coils, motors, and cheap tricks, anything that could spark, hum, or spin. Now, he was thinking like that same boy again. He drew sketches in the dirt, a loop of wire, a battery, a switch. What if he could redirect power? What if the tank's own mass, its armor, its current, its wiring, could be turned against it? He remembered something from basic training. German tanks used electrical ignition and hydraulic steering sensitive systems that relied on current traveling through a series of relays. Interfere with that current at the right moment, and the whole thing could lock up. "Stop the current," he whispered, staring at the loop in his hand. "Stop the beast." Outside, thunder rumbled again, or maybe it wasn't thunder. At dawn, the 88 seconds opened up. The Tiger came through the fog like a monster from another world, treads grinding mud, armor glistening wet. Its crew inside, 5 men, worked with calm precision. Inside that steel shell, Captain Otto Brandt, the commander, adjusted his periscope and spoke evenly in German. "Range, 200 meters. Sherman ahead. Fire." The gunner pressed the trigger. The cannon barked, recoil slamming through the hull. Through the smoke, Brandt saw the American tank explode in a blossom of fire. He had commanded Tigers since Kursk. He knew their power. He also knew their weakness, weight, fuel, and maintenance. But against the Americans, they were gods. He didn't know that 200 meters ahead, hidden under the road, Daniel Reeves and his team had laid something no German manual had ever warned about. The plan was insane. It wasn't a minefield. It wasn't even explosive. It was a trap made of wire, hundreds of loops strung through puddles, tied to buried batteries and leftover capacitors, disguised under debris. Daniel crouched beside it, hands trembling slightly as he closed the final switch. "If this works, we might live," he muttered. "If it doesn't, well, we won't know." His radio operator glanced nervously at the horizon. "Are you sure this'll do anything?" Daniel smirked. "No." Moments later, the Tiger appeared. Every vibration shook the ground. Every tread sounded like a countdown. Daniel watched through binoculars as the massive machine rolled closer, its turret scanning. Then it hit the loop. A crack of light barely visible in the dawn mist jumped from the puddle to the tank's track, a faint hiss, like a serpent exhaling. Then, silence. Inside the Tiger, Captain Brandt felt it instantly, a flicker, a shock through the controls. The dials spun wildly, then went dead. The turret stopped mid-turn. The entire system went rigid. "What happened?" the gunner shouted. "Hydraulics down," the mechanic yelled, hammering the panel. "We've lost main power." Brandt swore. "Manual control." But even that failed. The Tiger shuddered, groaned, and died. To the Americans watching from the tree line, it looked like a miracle. The unstoppable machine stopped. Daniel stared, breath held. "Did that just—" "Yes," the radio operator whispered. "It's dead." For a moment, no one moved. Then, like breaking a spell, someone laughed. The laughter spread. Soldiers who had spent weeks running from these monsters were now watching one sit helpless in the mud. Daniel didn't laugh. He just watched it quietly, his heart hammering. He had done it. Somehow, he had turned wire and mud into a weapon. Inside the Tiger, panic. Brandt's crew tried everything, rewiring, cranking, shouting over one another. Then came the sound that froze their blood, a hollow metallic ping from outside. Rifle rounds. The Americans were closing in. Brandt slammed his fist against the console. "Out! Everyone out!" They scrambled through the hatch, smoke and steam billowing behind them. From the ridge, Daniel watched them surrender, proud men in soot-streaked uniforms, hands raised, faces bewildered. He should have felt triumph. Instead, he felt pity. They weren't monsters, just men trapped inside one. By evening, word had spread across the division. An engineer had stopped a Tiger without firing a shot. Officers wanted to know how. Journalists wanted pictures. But Daniel just sat alone in the barn again, staring at the muddy coil of wire in his hands. The truth was simple and terrifying. He didn't fully know why it worked. He had guessed at resonance, grounding, and electrical bleed. Maybe the tank's own circuits had overloaded. Maybe luck had struck. It didn't matter. It worked once. That was enough. Still, something gnawed at him. War had turned invention into survival, and survival into destruction. He had built something beautiful, and it had killed. That night, he couldn't sleep. He dreamed of sparks dancing along armor, of men trapped in machines they no longer controlled. He woke before dawn, drenched in sweat. He went outside, breathing the cold morning air, and whispered to himself, "Never again." But the army had other plans. By the end of that week, engineers from higher command arrived. They took his notes, his equipment, even the loop itself. They shook his hand, promised recognition, and left him with nothing but a blank report stamped, classified. He was transferred 2 months later, wounded in an air raid before ever seeing another Tiger. No medal, no mention, just a rumor whispered among soldiers, the man who stopped a Tiger with a wire. Years later, long after the war, a historian found Daniel Reeves's field journal in an archive, its pages brittle, covered in sketches of loops and circuits. At the bottom of one page, written in faded pencil, were the words, "It wasn't genius, it was fear turned into current." And somewhere in a museum in Munich, the rusted shell of a Tiger tank sits under a spotlight, a small, corroded piece of wire still looped around its track. Visitors walk by without noticing. But if you stand close enough, in the quiet, you can almost hear the faint hum of what it meant, one man's desperate spark against the unstoppable. The storm over France hadn't lifted for 3 days. The clouds hung low, swollen with cold rain that turned roads into rivers of mud and iron. Somewhere behind the front line, the American 3rd Armored was regrouping, repairing, and pretending not to remember the last time a Tiger came through. In a leaky tent full of radio parts, Corporal Daniel Reeves stared at the single coil of copper wire that had made him famous and anonymous all at once. Headquarters had taken everything, the prototype, the notes, even the ruined tiger carcass. They'd told him it was for study. Then they'd reassigned him to a support company whose only job was to clear mines. He was supposed to forget. He couldn't. Each night he replayed the moment in his head, the flash, the hiss, the way the monster had shuddered and gone still. It hadn't felt like victory. It had felt like a secret whispered by the universe and then taken back again. He lit a cigarette, coughed, and stared at his trembling hands. The war was ending, maybe. But for an engineer there was always another problem to solve. Another way to keep men alive. At division headquarters, two colonels were arguing over his report. One lucky short circuit, the first barked. "You can't build doctrine on luck." The other tapped the folder. "Maybe not luck, maybe resonance. You ever think about that? A field current traveling through the treads into the ignition?" "Superstition," the first said. "You want to chase fairy tales while Patton's boys freeze out there?" They shelved the report. War had no patience for men who asked why after they'd already won how. 2 weeks later, Daniel was back on the road, laying wire again, this time for telephones. The fields around Bastogne were littered with frozen equipment, twisted hulls half buried in snow. The silence was heavy, broken only by the occasional crack of distant artillery. He knelt in the mud, stripping insulation from a line, when he heard the sound that never left him. The low, rhythmic growl of a heavy engine. His throat went dry. Across the field, beyond a line of burnt trees, a tiger rolled slowly through the mist. Its paint was faded, its armor patched, but its presence was the same. A cathedral of steel moving on chains. Daniel's captain swore, "They're not supposed to be here. Armor, fall back." The engineers scattered, diving for ditches. Daniel stayed crouched, frozen, eyes locked on the beast. He saw something new this time, fear inside the machine. German soldiers riding the hull looked thin, pale, desperate. The war had turned, the hunters were hunted. He crawled toward the communications truck. "We can stop it," he shouted. "Not this again, Reeves." But he was already unwinding cable. "Give me a minute. Just one." The captain hesitated, then waved him on. "You've got 60 seconds, Einstein." He rigged the line fast, bare hands in ice water, copper against steel. No batteries this time, just the field generator from their radio truck. He wrapped the loop across a puddle where the tank would pass, tied the ends to the generator's posts, and waited. The tiger crept closer, engine coughing. Daniel flipped the switch. A thin arc of blue light snapped between the wires. The smell of ozone filled the air. The tank kept coming. 50 yards. 40. The driver inside, who had survived Kursk, Normandy, and every hell in between, felt a sudden tug through the pedals. The tiger lurched once, twice, then its lights flickered out. Daniel's breath caught. The gun barrel drooped slightly, like the neck of an exhausted animal. Steam hissed from the engine vents. Then silence. The captain stared. "I'll be damned." Daniel didn't move. He just whispered, "It works." Again. Inside the tiger, Captain Otto Brandt slammed his fist into the control panel. Sparks jumped. The radio was dead, the turret frozen. The smell of burning insulation filled the cabin. "What is this?" the gunner cried. Brandt didn't answer. He knew. Somewhere out there, some clever enemy with dirt under his fingernails had found the one invisible weapon the Reich had no armor against: knowledge. He climbed out of the hatch, snow pelting his face, and looked toward the American lines. For a heartbeat he imagined seeing that man, the ghost with the wire. He almost wanted to salute him. Then the American artillery found them. By dusk the field was quiet again. Daniel sat beside the smoking wreck, notebook on his knee. He wrote only one line: "Electricity kills engines. Ignorance kills men." He tore the page out and stuffed it into his jacket. That night, when the medics came, they found him asleep beside the dead tank, the glow of distant fires reflecting in his glasses. After the war, both men vanished into history. Brandt was listed missing somewhere in Bavaria during the retreat. Daniel went home to Ohio, opened a repair shop, married a nurse, and never spoke about the war again. Until one winter evening in 1951, a journalist from Popular Mechanics knocked on his door, carrying a worn photograph. A Tiger tank in a field, its hull wrapped in a loop of wire. "Corporal Reeves?" the man asked. "Did you build this?" Daniel looked at the photo for a long time. "I built a lot of things," he said. "Did it work?" He smiled faintly. "Once." The journalist waited for more, but Daniel just returned the photo. Some tricks aren't worth repeating. When the man left, Daniel sat by his workbench, staring at the coils of copper and the hum of a little desk fan. The sound reminded him of a battlefield long ago, when one desperate idea had frozen a monster in place. He turned off the fan and whispered to the empty room, "Sleep now, old beast." Outside, the wind rose and hissed softly through the wires, like current finding its way home. Spring came to northern France, as if the earth had forgotten the war. The trees along the Meuse were green again, but the ground beneath them was still full of iron. Sherman tracks rusted in the fields, burned half-tracks served as nests for birds. The front had moved east, leaving behind engineers and scavengers to clear what was left. Corporal Daniel Reeves walked through the wreckage with a coil of wire slung over his shoulder and a notebook in his hand. His new orders were simple: recover, usable, metal for headquarters. No one mentioned the word Tiger, but every time a ruined hull groaned in the wind, he felt it again, that mix of awe and terror. He found one near the edge of the forest, a Tiger half sunk in mud, its turret blown open. The Germans had abandoned it months earlier. Now it sat quiet, a monument to its own arrogance. Daniel climbed onto the hull, boots clanging against armor that once laughed at shells. The smell of burnt oil was still strong. He touched the broken track where his wire loop might have bitten months before and felt a tremor in his chest. Electricity always finds a path. "Still trying to talk to ghosts, Corporal?" Lieutenant Hall's voice came from below. He was grinning, but tired, like every officer who had seen too many miracles turn into paperwork. "Sir," Daniel said, sliding down the side. "Command wants a demonstration," Hall told him. "They're bringing in brass from London. If you can prove your trick wasn't just luck, they'll give you a lab instead of a shovel." Daniel blinked. "You're serious?" "Never been less funny in my life. They want you in Reims by the weekend. Bring your toys." Reims smelled of coffee and burnt rubber. The city was half ruin, half celebration, liberated but still bleeding. Inside a requisitioned wine cellar, a dozen officers gathered around a long table, cluttered with transformers, cables, and an old German generator. Daniel sat up quietly, hands steady, eyes hollow. He had built 3 versions of the device. A crude loop powered by a Jeep battery. A magnetized coil meant to feed current directly into the steel treads. A hybrid rig with capacitors scavenged from destroyed radios. Colonel Blake, the senior officer, watched with a cigar in his mouth. "They say you can stop a tank with copper wire. That true, Corporal?" Daniel shrugged. "It's not the wire that stops it, sir. It's what rides the wire." Blake chuckled. "Show us, then." They towed in a captured Panther tank for the test. It wasn't a Tiger, but close enough to make everyone nervous. Mechanics hooked Daniel's rig to the vehicle's right tread, running the line through a shallow puddle. "Ready," Daniel shouted. The engine started, growl of German engineering filling the cellar yard. The tank rolled forward 3 feet. Daniel flipped the switch. A sharp crack. Blue light arced under the hull. The engine coughed once, twice, then died. The smell of ozone filled the air. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Blake dropped his cigar. "I'll be damned." Daniel unplugged the wire calmly. Current jumped from the puddle through the track and fried the relay coils. Same principle that knocks radios dead in lightning storms. One of the scientists scribbled notes furiously. "It's not consistent," Daniel warned. "Depends on moisture, soil, grounding, lot of luck." Blake grinned. "Luck's fine by me. You just gave us a new kind of mine." Word spread fast. Engineers started experimenting across the front. Some used field generators, others rigged spare vehicle batteries to rail spikes. They called it Reeves's Loop. Daniel hated the name. Every time someone said it, he saw the faces of the men who hadn't lived long enough to see any miracles. Still, the tests worked. A handful of Tigers were found abandoned, engines fused, controls dead. No one could explain exactly how. Daniel wrote to Hall. "They'll weaponize it. I built a trick to stop killing. and they'll use it to kill faster. Hall wrote back, "That's what armies do." Across the lines, Captain Otto Brandt limped into a field workshop in the Ruhr. He was alive barely. His last Tiger had burned out outside Aachen. The engineers blamed faulty grounding. Brandt knew better. He had felt the jolt in his bones, the invisible hand that reached through steel and said stop. Now he watched a young mechanic weld new copper shielding around another Tiger's electrical lines. "You think this will save it?" Brandt asked. "Command says the Americans have a new weapon," the man replied. "Some kind of electromagnetic mine." Brandt stared at the welding sparks. "No, it's not a weapon. It's a man." The mechanic frowned. "Sir? Someone out there built this, someone clever, and he's hunting us." By March 1945, the Allied advance had turned the German West Front into chaos. Bridges blown, convoys crawling through mud, everything running on borrowed fuel and nerves. Daniel rode with a convoy of engineers heading toward the Rhine. His truck bed was filled with spools of wire and battery packs. He spent the journey sketching diagrams of feedback loops, grounding rods, coils. The others called him Doc Frankenstein. That night they camped near a destroyed village. The moon was bright enough to see the glint of tank wrecks in the fields. Daniel sat by the fire, staring at his hands. They were shaking again. "You okay, Reeves?" a sergeant asked. He nodded. "Yeah, just thinking about circuits." The sergeant laughed. "You and your damn wires. The rest of us think about girls. You think about loops." Daniel smiled weakly. "Maybe that's why I'm still alive." Near midnight the ground began to vibrate. Everyone froze. Another Tiger. The convoy scattered. Engines roared. Rifles clattered. Daniel grabbed his kit and ran toward the roadside ditches. He could see it now, huge, black against the horizon, moving slow but unstoppable. He had maybe 3 minutes. He threw open the generator case, pulled out a spool, and started laying line across the road. His fingers were numb, but his mind was clear. Connect. Ground. Flood. The tank was closer now, headlight beams cutting through smoke. He heard German voices shouting, confident. He finished the loop, shoved the battery posts into the mud, and crouched behind a log. Come on, he whispered. The Tiger reached the wire. A flash brighter than lightning tore across the road. For a second everything went white. Then the sound of an engine choking, gears grinding, metal screaming. Daniel opened his eyes. The tank had stopped mid-turn. Turret frozen, lights out. The crew bailed, coughing in the smoke. No one fired, no one moved. He had done it again. When dawn came, his men found him sitting beside the dead Tiger, rain dripping from his helmet brim, the wire loop still glowing faintly in the mud. Lieutenant Hall arrived hours later, soaked and furious. "You're supposed to wait for orders, Reeves." Daniel looked up slowly. "Would you rather wait for shells?" Hall sighed. "The brass will decorate you for this, you know." "I don't want medals," Daniel said. "I want to stop hearing that sound." "What sound?" "The one they make when they stop breathing." Hall didn't ask which they, he meant the tanks or the men inside them. By April, the war was almost done. The loop trick was already obsolete. German armor was running out of fuel before it reached the front. The engineers packed up, went home, and forgot. Daniel didn't. He returned to Ohio with boxes of wire and notebooks he swore he'd never open again. He worked at a power company, fixed fuses, raised 2 kids. But sometimes, when lightning flashed over the fields, he'd see that moment again. The flash, the stillness, the beast collapsing under its own weight. And far away, in a Munich scrapyard, Captain Otto Brandt found the rusting remains of one of his old Tigers. He placed a hand on the armor and whispered, "You weren't beaten by guns. You were beaten by a spark." He left a coil of copper wire on the track and walked away. The Rhine looked endless that morning, broad, gray, and cold enough to bite bone. March 1945. The war was collapsing, but nobody trusted good news. Every bridge across the river had been blown. What was left were pontoons, floating planks, and hope. Corporal Daniel Reeves stood on the west bank beside a line of trucks stacked with coils of copper wire. Engineers swarmed like ants, laying cables for field phones and detonators. Somewhere upstream, German armor was regrouping, maybe Tigers, maybe Ghosts. Command wanted the crossing ready before nightfall. Reeves, Lieutenant Hall called, voice half lost in wind. They say you're our lucky charm. Let's pray your magic still works. Daniel gave a tired smile. Luck's not repeatable, sir. Circuits are. He knelt in the mud and began threading wire through the shallows. The river's current tugged at it, whispering like static. His plan was simple. Bury a loop in the wet embankment, run power from a portable generator, and wait. If the tigers came, they'd have to cross that patch of river road first. Maybe, just maybe, the current would leap the way it had before. Hall crouched beside him. You're betting on lightning in a bottle? Daniel twisted the ends together. No, sir. I'm betting on water, copper, and fear. Across the river, Captain Otto Brandt watched through binoculars. He had one working tiger left, number 217, and a crew of men who had long stopped believing in victory. Their uniforms were threadbare, their rations moldy, but their machines still breathed. He stroked the armor like a priest touching an altar. Once more, he murmured. One last hunt. His gunner, Kurt, wiped grease from his hands. Orders? Hold the crossing. Make them pay for every meter. Kurt hesitated. We barely have fuel. Then we won't need to retreat. They both knew what that meant. The Tiger's engine coughed to life, belching smoke across the riverbank. Somewhere out there, Brandt imagined, was the American with the wires, the invisible duelist he had never met. By noon, the wind shifted east, bringing the smell of diesel. The American scouts spotted movement beyond the far ridge. Tigers, one reported over the radio. At least one confirmed. Hall looked at Daniel. Well, Professor, showtime. Daniel's stomach turned cold. He checked the generator, steady hum, good voltage. Rain started to fall, a blessing in disguise. Wet ground made for better conduction. He crouched behind a truck, headphones on, wire spool in hand, the other engineers watching from foxholes. The first shot came from the German side, an 88mm shell that screamed overhead and took the roof off a barn. Mud splattered the air. Daniel flinched but kept his grip on the switch. He could feel the tanks approach through the ground, each tread thudding like a heartbeat. Wait till it's close, Hall whispered. Closer. 50 yards, 40. The Tiger broke through the trees, armor glistening wet, cannon sweeping. Daniel's pulse matched its rhythm. He could see Brandt through the periscope slit, calm, expressionless. Now, Hall shouted. Daniel slammed the switch. For an instant, nothing happened. Then the air ripped open with blue light. A hiss, a crack, the smell of burning insulation. Inside the Tiger, every gauge spiked. The steering froze, the engine howled, then died. Sparks shot from the radio. Brandt's hand jerked back as flame licked across the controls. Power failure, Kurt yelled. Everything's dead. Brandt looked through the periscope and saw the Americans rising from their trenches. They weren't running. They were watching. He understood. He's here, he said quietly. The man with the wire. He pushed the hatch open and climbed out, revolver in hand, not to fight, but to see. Across the gray river he spotted a figure kneeling beside a generator, rain dripping from his helmet, cables glowing in the mud. For a brief moment their eyes met across 200 yards of open ground. Two engineers, both sons of electricity, both tired of killing. Brandt lowered his pistol. Then another shell hit the Tiger square in the turret. The explosion threw him backward, smoke swallowing everything. Daniel shielded his face as the blast echoed. When the smoke cleared, the Tiger was a burning silhouette. The rain hissed as it struck hot metal. He felt no triumph, only emptiness. Hall clapped his shoulder. You did it again, Reeves. You saved the bridge. Daniel nodded, voice hollow. And killed men I never saw. Better them than us. Daniel didn't answer. He walked down to the wreck once the firing stopped. The riverbank was littered with fragments, shards of armor, melted wire, a single copper coil twisted like a snake. He knelt and picked it up, the metal still warm. A body lay beside the tank. German officer's jacket, eyes half open, rain washing soot from his face. The man looked peaceful. Daniel didn't know his name, but he recognized him. He whispered, I didn't mean for it to be you. He placed the copper coil beside the corpse like an offering. 3 days later, the Rhine crossings succeeded, The German lines shattered. Reporters came, snapping photographs of the miracle device that had stopped a tiger dead. They wanted to pose Daniel beside his wires, smiling. He refused. One journalist pressed him. "Corporal, what do you call it?" He thought for a long time. "A reminder," he said finally, "that everything conducts." When the war ended weeks later, the army classified his files and sent him home. His invention never made the manuals. Tanks changed, electronics advanced, and the wire loop faded into rumor. But sometimes, when thunder rolled across his Ohio farm, Daniel would step outside, feel the tremor under his boots, and remember the moment when lightning obeyed him. He never built another weapon. He fixed radios, taught night classes, raised 2 children who thought their father just liked tinkering with wires. They didn't know that once, in the rain beside a great river, he had stopped a god made of steel with nothing but a copper loop and the stubborn belief that even monsters could short out. Time buried the war in dust and paper. The great engines of the 1,940 seconds were now relics in museums. The men who built and broke them had gray hair or graves. In a quiet corner of the U.S. Army Archives, a clerk boxed up another folder labeled Experimental Field Devices European Theater, 1945. Inside was a single report, water-stained and unsigned, describing how a wire loop, when properly grounded, may disable the ignition systems of enemy armored vehicles through induced current. No one read it again for 70 years. But history has a habit of flickering back to life. In 2018, a restoration crew at the Bovington Tank Museum in England opened the engine compartment of a rusted Tiger recovered from the Rhine River. Inside, coiled neatly around one of the tracks, they found a loop of copper fused black by heat. It didn't belong. The curator, puzzled, sent photographs to military historians in the States. Weeks later, the images landed on the desk of Dr. Laura Reeves, professor of electrical engineering at Ohio State University. She was 62, with her father's hands and his same habit of squinting at machinery as if it were half alive. She stared at the photo for a long time. The wire was twisted in a way she knew by instinct, double-wrapped with a field splice her father had taught her when she was 10. She picked up the phone and called the museum. "That wire," she said quietly, "it belonged to someone I know." She flew to England that month. The museum was cold, the air smelling of oil and rust. Under the lights, the Tiger looked more like a corpse than a weapon, hulking, hollow, haunted. The curator pointed at the wire coil. "We think it was part of a demolition charge," he said. "Maybe sabotage?" Laura shook her head. "No, it was a loop. My father built those." The curator blinked. "Your father?" "He was an engineer in the 3rd Armored Division. He told me stories about electricity and fear." She paused, touching the edge of the track. "He said he once stopped a Tiger without a bullet." The man laughed softly, thinking she meant it as metaphor. She didn't correct him. That evening, the museum allowed her to stay after hours. Alone under the lights, she walked slowly around the Tiger, fingertips brushing its cold armor. The metal hummed faintly with the echo of old energy, memory made solid. She remembered being a little girl, sitting at her father's workbench while he repaired radios. He never talked about the war, not directly. But sometimes, when the thunder rolled, he'd glance at the window and murmur, "That's what it sounded like right before it stopped." He'd shown her the trick once, a simple loop of copper, a battery, a bit of water. When the switch flipped, the coil jumped like it was alive. He'd smiled, tired but proud. "See, kiddo, electricity always finds a way home." She hadn't understood then. She did now. Meanwhile, in Germany, a historian named Klaus Brandt was finishing a book about the final days of his grandfather, a tank commander who vanished near the Rhine. In his research, he found a faded field diary kept by one of the crew. It contained a single surviving entry dated March 1945. "Engine stopped. No impact. Light everywhere." Captain said, "The enemy used the air itself as a weapon." He looked across the river and saluted before the fire came. Klaus sent a copy of the entry to Bovington for confirmation. The curator connected him with Laura. 2 descendants, one American, one German, met under the shadow of the same steel beast that had bound their families together in ways no one had planned. They talked for hours in hushed voices among the exhibits. He showed her the diary. She showed him the photo of the wire. The pieces fit like polarity in a circuit, opposites completing each other. It wasn't hatred that built these, she said, touching the tiger's armor. It was fear. And maybe genius, Klaus added. Your father understood both. She smiled faintly. He called it luck. Later that night, when the museum had gone quiet, she placed a small notebook at the foot of the display. Inside were her father's old sketches, loops, circuits, notes in pencil, smudged by time. On the last page, in his handwriting, it said, "Electricity kills engines, ignorance kills men. Use one to stop the other." The curator found it the next morning and decided to leave it there. Some artifacts don't need labels. Back in Ohio, a summer storm rolled across the plains. Laura sat on her porch, listening to thunder, the smell of rain thick in the air. She imagined her father as he once was, mud on his face, rain in his eyes, crouched beside a humming generator while a giant of steel bore down on him. She imagined the German officer across the river raising his eyes just before the light came. Two men connected by a loop of copper and a moment of understanding neither would live to explain. The thunder cracked again. For a split second, the world flashed white. Somewhere far away, an old memory completed its circuit. In the archives, the declassified report finally received a footnote. Field test confirmed, localized electrical induction capable of disabling armored vehicles under specific moisture and grounding conditions, developed by CPL, Daniel H. Reeves, U.S. Army Engineers, 1,945, technique not reproduced. No medals, no fame, just a few lines in history and a quiet acknowledgement that a single mind, armed with wire and desperation, had once humbled the mightiest machine on earth. Visitors at Bovington still stop before the Tiger display. They read the plaque about engine design, the war, the battles. Few notice the small coil of copper resting beside the tread. Fewer still understand what it means. But sometimes, when lightning flashes outside and the lights flicker across the museum floor, the wire glows faintly for a heartbeat, as if remembering. And if you stand there long enough, you might swear you hear the faintest hum like a current running through time carrying with it the ghost of two men, one who built monsters and one who learned how to stop them.